Thank you everyone so much for joining us. It's the second to last session at Bread and Net. It's been a pleasure to connect with so many activists and organizers working on digital rights, and to hear about your activism, the challenges you've been facing, and how we can all support each other. I want to give out a shout out to the SMEX team for some excellent organizing and for bringing us all together. I hope you all have some fun plans for the evening when you get rid of us. My name is Bissan Fakih. I'm a senior campaigner at Digital Action, and we're a global organization bringing people and ideas together to strengthen democracy in the digital age. I'm honored to introduce our speakers today, Dia Kayyali, who's the Associate Director of Advocacy at Mnemonic, and Marwa Fatafta, who leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region as the MENA Policy Manager. Dia and Marwa are both leaders in our struggle to promote and protect our digital rights. I have personally learned so much from them and had my thinking shaped by their incredible work. And I'm so excited to hear their analysis today and maybe even calls to action as we discuss the Facebook papers. So just before I quickly hand over the floor to our speakers for their opening remarks, I just want to give a very quick brief on the Facebook papers. So the Facebook papers are a trove of internal Facebook documents that were leaked to the US Securities and Exchange Commission by whistleblower Frances Haugen. And then these same papers were reviewed by a consortium of media outlets, which put out a series of media stories that many of us saw, from Instagram's harmful effect on teenage girls to a lack of action on calls for violence in India. Until recently, it was only English language outlets that had access, but these documents are going to be made public very soon. And just briefly, the papers gave an inside view into how Facebook makes its decisions, but also how much it knew in terms of the harms the platform was causing, and how it chose in many cases, or almost all cases really, to put its profits above these considerations. So if it's okay, I'm going to turn to you first, Dia. You've seen the papers firsthand. What were some of your key takeaways from reviewing them? And in particular, what were your findings in terms of how Facebook was treating the Arabic language?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. And thanks so much for having me in this really important discussion. So I think it's important to say that what I've seen in the papers so far, first of all, it's only a fraction. We're talking about a huge amount of documents. That being said, there is quite a bit about our region, and this is how I'll put it. I would say that it is the worst case scenario for Arabic speakers. Now, to put it into perspective, looking through the papers, it's become really clear that Arabic is a very widely used language on Facebook. We're not arguing for Facebook to improve resources for 100 people. We are talking about, this is from the documents, and I apologize because I don't know what every single abbreviation means. So by one measure, and this is from a Facebook engineer's presentation, by one measure, Arabic is the third most spoken language. By another member, it's the fifth most spoken language. And I think, that just depends on what users are choosing or how they're defining which language users are speaking. That being said, either way, it's a lot of users. So that's the first premise, is that this is a very important language. Second, we have very bad moderation going on in Arabic, and this is for a variety of reasons. And I'm talking about at the level where something has been reported and someone is actually reviewing it. And I think a lot of people have seen this in the articles that have come out, but when you actually look at the documents, it becomes even more clear how bad this is, where the moderation is happening. So the vast majority of moderation of Arabic language content is happening by reviewers in Morocco. And these are reviewers that are not necessarily having their ability to understand other dialects checked. And in fact, even the people who are overseeing those people, the people who are doing spot checks to make sure that the contracted out content moderators are doing a good job, there's no check on their ability to handle different dialects. So we have people in the Morocco office moderating content from Iraq, moderating content from Egypt, moderating content from Yemen. And Yemen, unfortunately, is one of the most impacted countries in terms of Facebook has almost no language expertise for that dialect. So there's bad moderation for a lot of users. And then, and this is why I say it's really the worst case scenario, we know that our countries are in various scenarios that make us at risk based on Facebook's own labeling of what makes an at-risk country. And in the documents, in their tier 1, we have Egypt, Syria, and Yemen. Tier 2 is Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Sudan. Tier 3, Qatar and Algeria. And then tier 4, the rest, which is interesting. Palestine is in tier 4. So this is, of course, a labeling that can be taken out of context, and there was not a lot of information accompanying it. But even based on what we know so far of their labeling system, obviously there's a need for a lot of resources in our region. And then here's the last point that I'll make about why it's the worst case scenario. We have, in addition to all of this, they're doing a terrible job of training machine learning. So those same people who are not doing a good job of moderating, in another document goes into how they are training their machine learning systems and who is labeling the content and what is their understanding of the dialect. And the person giving this presentation from Facebook was very critical. They were saying, we have people labeling this content that don't understand what they're seeing. There's some specific examples in there of how in one dialect, something that is a huge insult is just a common thing that you would say in another dialect. So they understand that this is a problem. They know that it's going on. They know that this is leading to not just huge amounts of content getting improperly taken down, because we know that, and this is, very much in Mnemonic's experience. And for those who are not familiar with Mnemonic, we have a Syrian archive, Yemeni archive, and Sudanese archive. And then, of course, we work and do emergency preservation of human rights related content from other countries in the region sometimes. But even with our own archives, I mean, the Yemeni archive has had a lot of content taken down recently. And when I look at this, when I look at this information, I'm like, of course it has. So we have a lot of content getting taken down improperly, but we also have a lot of content, including very specifically, these documents show a lot of hate speech, a lot of really inflammatory content, a lot of anti-LGBTQ content that gets left up. Oh, and also I should have mentioned, I mean, this is a whole section of the papers for the Gulf region. There's a whole discussion about how human trafficking is being facilitated on the platform. And so all of that content is being left alone. And then the content that so many of us are concerned about, human rights documentation, political content, very valid political discussions that people want to have, this is getting taken down. So it's the worst of all case scenarios. It's not just over moderation or under moderation. It's just going wrong in both directions. And then, as we have always suspected, none of this is surprising. It's very much happening with their knowledge, and it is the problem is always being compounded. Once you teach machine learning, I like to think of machine learning algorithms that are on Facebook. I think of them as like trained dogs. And anybody who knows anything about dog training knows that if you train your dog incorrectly, it's going to do what you want it to do because it wants to please you. Well, these machine learning algorithms want to please Facebook. They want to do what they've been taught, and what they've been taught is very faulty, based on very poor labeling. And it's just getting, and then it teaches itself. It compounds the problem. So, in my opinion, this is really a crisis. And my opinion is reflected by these engineers and these policy people inside of Facebook who are trying to convince Facebook to do the right thing. They're saying we have to treat different Arabic dialects differently. We have to treat political content fairly. I think one of the really interesting things about the Facebook papers is seeing how much Facebook employees themselves have been reflecting exactly what civil society has been saying. I mean, sometimes it's a little weird because you read something from a Facebook person that you're like, did you just take that from, a blog post that we wrote? Are you aware that this is exactly what, Mnemonic said 5 years ago, or Access said 6 years ago? But it's nice to see. So that being said, you wonder, who is it that's ignoring them? Who is it that sees these presentations and then just decides to keep doing business as usual? So I think that's where we're at. That's what the Facebook papers have shown for the region, is just, I would call it malfeasance, just completely ignoring the reality, even though you have so many users in this region, even though you acknowledge that so many countries in the region are at risk in various ways. I think that the at-risk rankings that we're talking about are at risk for serious violence or mass killings, things like that. It's a very, very bad situation. And while I really appreciate that there is more discussion happening, although I have to point out, because it's the 26th, right? It's been a month and a day since these papers were released. I mean, most of these, the bulk of articles came out on October 25th. Where is the discussion now? Are we talking about the Facebook papers, or are we talking about Meta? Did Facebook do a very good job of shifting the discussion? And I think the answer is yes. However, as we will go into in the discussion, and I'm going to wrap up now my introduction, as we're going to go into, I think there's still more that can be done with these papers. So I look forward to talking about that.
Thanks so much, Dia. I mean, that's really incredible insight to begin with, just in terms of what you've seen, but also the kind of challenge ahead of us, because you're talking about a worst case scenario, and you use the word crisis, right? I mean, for me, that means we need to get going, and it's not just us, but there's a challenge that needs to be taken on for sure. So thank you so much for that. And Marwa, I'm going to move on to you. I guess my first question is, what was your initial reaction to these papers? And then what are some of the key takeaways that you had as well after, going through them or going through the articles that came out afterwards?
Hi, Bissan. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. I just wanted to say, big +1 to everything that Dia mentioned. They pretty much resonate with my own reaction to the Facebook papers. I should know that I have not seen them yet. I've only read what's been publicly reported about the papers. And of course, they're not surprising. Yet, they are validating our experience and the experience of many activists and Arabic-speaking users around the region. And I think it points to the point that Dia mentioned earlier. It's willful negligence by the platform. They know the problem internally and externally. There hasn't been a shortage of documentation, analysis, and now we know also by their own engineers and internal employees sounding the alarm on many of the issues that their content moderation policies and system is producing, and the real world harm effects as a result of those decisions. And yet, at every ebb and flow, Facebook decides to ignore the problem. Now, at what level these decisions are taken, it's important to probably keep that in mind. But this raises a question in my head, and this is something that I would love to discuss in this session and also later. We know by now, for the last 10 years, that Facebook is not interested in solving content moderation issues. The system does not work. It's a failure, especially in our region, where, as Dia perfectly pointed it out, it's a worst case scenario. Political speech is being censored and over moderated, while harmful content like hate speech and disinformation is left rampant on the platform. So every complaint there is out there in this world about Facebook and its content moderation failures, we have it in our region. And yet, of course, for Facebook, as we learned in different sessions during Bread and Net, that especially with the discussion between Mohammed and Ashraf Zaytoun, the former Facebook employee, Facebook is only able to move and make action when there is a regulation threat or when its bottom line is being threatened or hurt. So this information is very useful, and we need to take it into consideration as civil society organizations, because advocacy, campaigning, media scandals is not working. And the biggest example and evidence to that is, yes, Facebook papers were out. I didn't actually realize it's been a month and a day. And what has Facebook done? Nothing. The Palestine campaign that we've worked on with many organizations, probably people are watching us now as well, all of that scandal, and it was reported in almost every international outlet that I know of. And yet, if you look at reports from a couple of days ago, Facebook is again censoring media outlets, Palestinian media outlets and Palestinian pages because of what happened in Jerusalem. So where are we going? Where are we moving from here? How can we break this cycle? I mean, Facebook's only response has been, well, we're now Meta. Some people say, of course, maybe it's a strategic decision for them or by them to kind of drown the conversation, or, there's one quote that I like from Mad Men, the show, if you don't like the conversation, change it. So I guess maybe they thought, we're going to change the conversation by rebranding. I personally don't think so. I think that Mark Zuckerberg is already eyeing the next big prize, as he did when he first started Facebook. He's already thinking, okay, now I want to move to this virtual world. And he's basically following his ambitions and dreams, and he simply does not care about the havoc that is being wreaked around the world because of his company's content moderation policies. Because he cannot be held legally liable, and there are no financial costs for him. So here's my question: how can we make it painful and costly for Facebook? And that's a question I don't particularly have answers to, but it's a question that I think we need to somehow answer collectively as activists and also as organizations.
Thank you so much, Marwa. I had the same question after the conversation earlier between Mohammed Najm and Ashraf Zaytouni. And actually, I'm going to open that up now, if that's okay. But basically, just for the people that weren't there, so Ashraf Zaytouni is the former MENA policy director at Facebook. He was the first one, actually, and he showed some significant frustration at the shortcomings of the platform and the kind of risks that were involved. And he actually said that the reason that he left was because of lack of resources, because he had requested additional employees and that wasn't given to him, right? And he mentioned the same thing that you did, Marwa, which is that they don't act unless governments compel them to take action. And then within the chat, people were talking about regulation here or in the region, as it were. But I mean, I don't know if that's a solution, but that's the question that I'd like to open up, which is how do we ensure accountability on this issue in the Arabic-speaking region, bearing in mind that we have a complicated relationship with our governments, and the internet has been very much a space of liberation for us.
Can I quickly jump on that? It's an excellent question. And unfortunately, in our region, as Ashraf, to quote Ashraf again, so we're not only fighting companies, we're also fighting our own governments. And given their terrible record on human rights, I wouldn't trust any government in our region, in the 22 countries, with regulating online space, because we know they would regulate it in a way that gives the authorities more discretion to interpret, censor, criminalize speech and action online. So where do we go from here? So we need the platforms, because that they are somehow cannot be directly influenced or managed by companies. So it gives us a bit of a buffer zone to exercise our rights. But of course, with all the censorship and the content moderation issues that we've discussed. And yet at the same time, we know that our governments don't protect or respect our fundamental rights. And so I think the bet here is on the ongoing discussions right now in the US and the EU to regulate these big platforms. And maybe Dia can comment more on that, because these regulations, especially the Digital Services Act being discussed at the EU level, would have a massive influence on platforms, and it will have a spillover effect around the globe. So whatever happens at the EU will not stay there. It will impact us one way or the other, and it will also impact the ecosystem. Let's put it this way. We are unfortunately in the region consumers of technology. We're not developers or engineers of the technologies we use on a daily basis. And so that ecosystem is set from the global north, and the current discussions might change that. And I think here I should mention that Access Now has put together with EFF, a human rights alliance, to discuss DSA, and also to bring South voices from the global South to be able to participate in this discussion. So if people are interested in joining that alliance, there is absolutely that space where you can learn about the DSA, but also bring in your own issues and maybe have a space on the table where you can influence European lawmakers. So I will stop at that point and maybe pass it on to Dia to share more on this regulation. Sorry, I'm playing the role of a moderator.
Yeah. So and I think I'll tweet out links to the DSA Human Rights Alliance statement that we put out recently. And I'll repeat a little bit of what I said in the blog post that accompanied that statement, which is that I think there's a huge role in particular for sort of diaspora organizations. So Mnemonic is in a very interesting position because we are a German organization, and we're a German organization that was founded by Syrians. And unfortunately, the reality is that even now, even with everything we've seen about who is being harmed the most, sometimes we see proposals and responses to regulatory proposals from civil society in the EU and the US that is still completely disconnected from the global reality. And I think that we really need to come to an understanding that any legislation that is passed in the US or the EU is going to have a global impact, especially the US and the EU. I mean, actually everywhere. If you look at our region, you can see how really bad regulatory proposals will spread amongst countries. So this is something in general with internet regulation that sort of authoritarian regimes will see some regulation of social media or regulation of misinformation and say, oh, great, we could do that here as well. But it also happens with things like Germany's NetzDG, where it gets copied. So this is a piece of legislation that leads to a lot of removal of content. And maybe it works okay in Germany, even though in Germany it's had problems, but where there's all these copycat legislation, it's having a very bad impact. So I think that there's a big role both for people from the region who are working in the US and the EU, but also really, I think it's time to see some real solidarity from civil society in those places. And I mean, that's why it's so fantastic that EFF and Access Now started this DSA Human Rights Alliance, because they are very big organizations. Access Now in particular has a really global reach, and you have staff around the world. And so it really makes sense to be pulling in those global voices into the discussion. That being said, it can be quite hard to convince EU and US lawmakers that they should be thinking from a global viewpoint. And I think one of the strategies there is to sort of we know that there's still, unfortunately, some mindset of the EU or the US really has something good to give to the region, and they should be acting as leaders. I don't necessarily want to encourage that, but if that's what's going to make them pass legislation that doesn't completely destroy us, that's what I'll do. So with the DSA, just so folks have a sense, the Digital Services Act is a very comprehensive piece of legislation, and it covers a lot of points. And this session is not about the DSA, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But just to say that exactly what Marwa said. So there are going to be global advocates, including myself, who are speaking to members of European Parliament to emphasize some of these points of how the EU can be a leader, and it can be a leader for bad, as we saw with the European Terrorist Content Online Regulation, which forces platforms to remove content in 1 hour and without necessarily judicial review. Or it can be a leader in a positive way. So the DSA has some pieces to it, including, for example, some pieces about assessing risk, about how very large platforms have more of a responsibility than small platforms. It has some provisions about transparency. All of these things have the real potential to be beneficial. And the last thing I'll say is that when it comes to regulatory proposals, what I would really like to see is more proposals in the US and the EU that are focused on transparency. And I don't just mean transparency reporting like we see now. I mean really in-depth transparency that requires them to make the kind of information that is in the Facebook papers public. And it requires it requires them to adhere to their own rules as well. That what they've made public, they actually have to comply with that. That it doing what they say they're doing. There could potentially be penalties. What I don't want to see is regulation that tries to make a lot of specific types of content illegal, and then tell the platforms to take that stuff down. I am very concerned about dangerous content. I'm very concerned about all the targeting of LGBTQ people. Obviously, all the instigation to genocide that we've seen around the world on Facebook. But I think a good first step is really forcing companies to be transparent about what they're doing, to follow fair processes so that people know what the rules are, know when they've broken a rule, get the chance to appeal, all these sorts of things. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is lawmakers want a silver bullet, right? They want to just quickly solve all the problems when the reality is that, social media is reflecting the real world very much. It's not an easy problem to solve. So sorry, I'll stop there because I'm sure there's more questions.
No, thank you so much, Dia. And I'm glad you're going to be in the room. And I will say, like, in terms of the kind of positive norms and the potential for that to travel, there was an interesting example from Lebanon the other day where there was an organization that somehow got a hold of all of the email addresses for people that had registered to vote in the elections, and they started emailing them. And people were absolutely scandalized, saying, like, how did you get my email address? This isn't right. This is illegal, et cetera, et cetera. And, the thing is that it's not illegal in Lebanon, right? But people had kind of taken these norms of GDPR where you have to consent to your data being given and kind of adopted them. And I think that's a quite healthy example. But there are also other quite terrible example where our content gets taken down and our freedom of speech gets affected because of legislation elsewhere. But now, just you brought up this idea of the EU Parliament, the UK. So Frances Haugen has been on a kind of advocacy trip, right? She's spoken at Congress, she's spoken at the EU, she's spoken in the UK, and there's been a slew of news reports about it. But what I want to ask is there anything that you think is missing from the conversation that we should discuss, either from what legislators are talking about or policymakers are talking about, what the companies have responded, or what the media is covering, that you think, just given your insights into the Arabic-speaking region, we should reintroduce into the conversation? Marwa, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, about the whistleblower herself and the policy tour or talk tour that she's doing in different parliaments and the discussions she's having. Let's not forget that it's only a few selected media organizations have had access to the papers. And many of the people who are outside of the US, so the majority of the user base of Facebook that are affected by its content moderation policies, apologies, we did not see any discussions in our region. We have not seen any coverage in Arabic that goes through the papers and analyzes them from our perspective in our language. So that discussion has been absolutely absent, and it's not by coincidence, it's by design. And I guess so far the conversations where, as we've mentioned, in terms of locations, and by extension of that in terms of issues of concern, they also remain around global north issues. So they are in a way recycling the same problem that Facebook has manufactured. Global north issues being prioritized, global south issues which are more affluent and so obvious, and they do need special attention, are left unattended. So the question mark, of course, here is that to what extent is the whistleblower and also the team that is supporting her, organizing all of those tours and her talking points, etc., are going to jump that bridge. And another thing I also wanted to mention that, and important to keep in mind, that she is not a policy person. She's a whistleblower, she's a data scientist. And even though she took the very brave step to blow the whistle on Facebook's many problems, she also jumped or skipped the huge body of work done by academics, activists, civil society organizations, pointing out to the very issues that she's mentioning. And so I think some of the solutions she's been providing, and all of the attention that she's getting, by media and also by lawmakers and government officials that are looking for solutions. And as Dia mentioned, they tend to love silver bullet solutions and easy recipes that they could just swallow, and all of a sudden disinformation disappears on the platform, and hate speech and terrorism, etc., etc. All of that has been dismissed, thrown out of the window. And I think unfortunately, we don't have the same platform. We're not the next shiny object. We're there always making noise and making trouble, to the extent that maybe some people don't want to hear what we're saying. Nevertheless, these voices are still absent from this ongoing story, and we need, or maybe I don't know who I think she has a responsibility to reach out to the individuals and organizations that have been working on these issues, and the policy recommendations being shared and proposed also need to take these prior work into consideration. Otherwise, we're just recycling the same issues again and again.
Thank you so much, Marwa. That definitely resonates. And I don't know, Dia, if you want to respond to that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, a big +1 to everything that Marwa said. And I think it's something that most of us at this point have said publicly, whether it's on Twitter or in a blog post. And I've certainly expressed a lot of frustration, I think, with both how she's representing, not necessarily how she's representing herself, but how she is being represented. And if you are a whistleblower and you're going to go out and do this policy tour, you have to make sure that you have advisors who are going to give you good advice. And it seems like it should have been part of her responsibility to make sure that she had a sense of this huge body of work. But even more than that, I publicly criticized her after she made a comment about end-to-end encryption in Messenger. And the day after, or 2 days later, she said, well, I was, the media misreported what I was actually saying. You should know how badly the media is going to twist everything you say if you are a whistleblower. Again, like I know that she has a team of people advising her. Somebody should have warned her. If you make a comment about end-to-end encryption in the current environment, it's not going to go well, because we are in an environment that is very hostile to end-to-end encryption. So be careful about what you say. Anybody, and this isn't just for her, anybody who has the press's attention, who is very palatable to the press for one reason or the other, whether it's their skin color or their passport or their title, needs to think about how whatever they're saying could potentially harm people who are more marginalized than them. And let's be honest, she does not fit the profile of the person who is the most harmed by the decisions that Facebook makes. Forget about the fact that she's a Facebook engineer, just as a person. So, I find that very frustrating. And then the other thing I'll say is that the sort of ideas that are being thrown around are not only are they disconnected from that big body of work, they're not pragmatic. They are very much these sort of silver bullet ideas, and it is very frustrating.
Yeah, I completely understand, and I do hope that, you know, that attention can be redirected to the right place, which is civil society, and the kind of shouting from the rooftops that's been done all the time. I think that's kind of one of the takeaways from the Facebook papers, which is that Facebook's own engineers were ignored and civil society was ignored, and it was just like, okay, let's put profit above everything else. So, you know, I hope mobilization will take us to the place where the right people are being listened to. And then just a kind of a quick question, but Marwa, you brought up the Global South, and Dia, so did you. How, you know, some of the kind of issues and the harms that Dia, you presented, do you think those are unique to the Arabic speaking region, or do you think there's something about, you know, a rest of world kind of situation that we're facing? And, you know, I'd like to hear more about that, but also about how we can work together more, or what we can do as a global South, for lack of a better term. And just before I hand it over, I want to invite everyone watching us to please submit your questions.
If I could maybe jump in on this one. Yeah, I think there's other documents, as I've been going through, that have caught my eye. In particular, another region that I have had the privilege to do some work in, and I say privilege because I can't say who I was working with for security reasons, but I had the opportunity to work with folks who are researching content moderation in India. And I have to say, everything that I said for our region, the same goes for India. I mean, and there it is incredibly disturbing. I mean, the amount of verifiable connections between real world violence and content posted on Facebook by politicians, by the BJP. You know, I've talked to the Wall Street Journal a number of times now about how Facebook very specifically was catering to the BJP. Sorry, that's for people who don't know, this is the party of Modi. It's a far-right Hindu nationalist party in India, which is very anti-Muslim, very anti-lower caste people. Really a fascist party at this point. I think it's fair to say that. So you know, there have been, I won't even get into all of the specific problems with India because that's like multiple panels, but just to say that it's been a really similar experience, and it's been a similar experience for activists and civil society there, where it's like, look, this is obvious what's going on, and Facebook just, you know, twists people's words, really misleads advocates, and actually, I mean, if you want to talk about solidarity, so Facebook has committed itself to doing to having an independent review of its content moderation practices with regards to Palestine. This is after many of us in civil society asked for it, and then the oversight board reflected that request in a case decision. So Facebook has said that it's going to do this. Well, over a year ago, Facebook committed itself to doing an independent audit of content moderation in India, and it contracted a law firm to do that. And many people in civil society spoke to that law firm. And over a year later, where is that independent assessment? It's gone. We haven't heard anything about it. Certainly nothing has been published publicly. We haven't heard from the people who are conducting the review. So we need to make sure, first of all, we need to make sure that doesn't happen with Palestine. Second of all, we should absolutely be talking to each other. And I will say, I'm just going to be really honest because that's sort of my brand. When all of that was going on with India, I did sometimes try to reach out to people in the region, and I didn't, in our region, and I didn't get a lot of interest. And I think that people, it's really easy when you are in crisis mode to not necessarily feel like you have the energy to engage with a whole other group of people. But that's been the only thing that's been really impactful, I think, is having a lot of people at once and getting press, making those connections and working with each other. So, you know, I really hope that we take this. Let's just take the press's decision to overlook a lot of the global south. Something actually I didn't say in response to the last question is that in the articles, there have been very few people from our region or from outside of the US or EU quoted. Like, there's people from the US speaking to problems in our region. Like, why? You know? So let's come together. We are sharing the same problems, and we really need to push back together.
Thanks so much, Dia. I couldn't agree more. I think especially if what you're talking about is a crisis, it sounds like, you know, it is a time for us to band together. And I think, you know, just it's valuable learning. Like what you've just shared about the audit is outrageous, that it's gone nowhere, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen for Palestine. I'm going to ask you the same question, Marwa, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I think in this session, I'm just going to be +1 to everything that Dia mentioned. I think there's absolutely a need for us in the region as activists and organizations to reflect on cross-national, cross-regional solidarity, because I think we absolutely need to do more. And maybe there's also a bit of self-interest in doing that, because we're not only showing support and participating, but also we can learn tactics and understand patterns either of censorship or ways where individuals and communities can push against this discrimination. I mean, I have not actually, I didn't know about the India audit, for instance, and now that Dia shared that, I think it's a lesson learned. You know, it's just by being on this panel and learning about this fact, it opens our eyes as activists and organizations that we need to pay attention, and we need to closely monitor this assessment and audit. And in case Facebook does not fulfill its commitment, we need to basically start campaigning again. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from this solidarity. And what I hope we can do, and I know there's been several discussions going on and maybe some thoughts and ideas floating around, is building some sort of an archive system where we can also document these takedowns and to be able to understand exactly how, then, when they happen, and to be able to do this regional or cross-regional campaigning. I think, you know, often when there is a crisis, we're all plunged into it, like what happened during the May events in Palestine, and we're trying to find every source available to respond to it. And when that crisis is over, we try to move to the next crisis and to the next crisis. And I think it would be important for us to reflect and think, okay, what are the tools that we missed back then, when we thought, I wish there was some sort of an archiving system where we can take screenshots and drop them there, or add links, or so. That's also a point that we need to be better at, and find solutions to be prepared, basically, when the next crisis happens. Because I said this before, and I'm going to say it again, the next crisis is just around the corner. It's a matter of time, especially that when Facebook insists on continuing to ignore the problems and not, even in our region, they're not even throwing money, which is their usual way of solving issues. So even that, we don't even have that. So I think we need to be better prepared and ready, and absolutely we need to build these relationships with Colombia. You know, let's not forget, when the Palestine takedowns happened, it happened also to users in India, communities, indigenous communities in Canada, and also protesters in Colombia. So it wasn't only Palestinians affected. And that, of course, speaks to the point that the issues are not necessarily in our region, but they are in the global south, and in different countries, and of course affecting the most marginalized in those countries as well.
Yeah, that's very sobering, Marwa. Thank you. And I agree completely on this point that we need to kind of be prepared for the next crisis. And Palestine has come up in this conversation as one of the really unfortunate case studies. But I wanted to ask if, you both mentioned that some of what civil society has been shouting at the rooftops about has been validated in the Facebook papers, right? What are some of the kind of practical case studies or the situations that we've witnessed or experienced in the region that kind of speak to what's in the papers and Facebook's decisions? And what can we expect down the line? Like, I mentioned this in an earlier session, we were talking about harms, but like the Lebanese elections are coming up, and there's no excuse. We don't need excuses to be shooting at each other. So what's going to happen then? So yeah, just a little bit more on kind of real world case studies, past and hopefully not, but future.
Yeah, I can start on that one, because as much as we can, Mnemonic has tried to track content removals of human rights documentation, and unfortunately, as I mentioned in my introductory comments, a lot of what we saw was about just how of over removal, and so we have seen the removal of a lot of human rights documentation as so-called terrorist and violent extremist content. And I think I said the number, and it's in the Politico article, that 77% of so-called terrorist and violent extremist content is improperly moderated. So we've absolutely seen that with these collections of human rights documentation. And we do notice, for example, for a brief period, the Houthis were a designated organization by the US government, and we then very quickly saw a bunch of content get taken down. This is also something that has been well documented in Lebanon, just during, and actually, I just say Lebanon, but Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, that during demonstrations, when people are posting live streams of violence that's happening to them, but it's not at the degree that it actually violates Facebook's policies, and actually Facebook also has another thing it can do, which is put this warning graphic content screen on it, but we don't even get that. The content just gets taken down, and it gets taken down as terrorist and violent extremist content. But it's someone filming a sit-in or filming protests, or actually trying to use a live stream to protect themselves from violence that is happening at that moment. So we've just seen massive takedowns of that. And now on a more anecdotal level, pages that talk about sexual health and pages that talk about anything related to LGBTQ, anything, I've gone on them myself and seen hateful comments and threats that are just left up for literally years. I mean, they just never get taken down. And again, this is very much in keeping with what we saw in the papers, that the moderators that are looking at this content don't understand it, or that they don't care, that they're maybe looking at the wrong dialect. I mean, there's a number of reasons why. But yeah, just these two sort of points on the opposite end of the spectrum, very, very obvious. I mean, it's not, it can't be a mistake.
Yeah, thanks, Dia. And so much of the LGBTQ hatred as well has been bots, which like they've been very clearly identifiable. So it's really inexcusable that it hasn't been taken down. And agree so much with the severity of what you've said. Like in some cases, that people have died trying to film that footage so that it can get out there, and then it's removed forever off these platforms. Marwa, I'd love to get your thoughts as well on this question of case studies and what to look out for in terms of threats, but also things that we've witnessed.
Yeah, I mean, the 77% figure of basically Facebook's automated or algorithms getting so-called violent content in Arabic language wrong was disturbingly high. I mean, we knew it's a problem. We knew that the algorithms, they don't understand our region, they don't understand our language, they don't understand context, but just the 77% figure is basically like exceeded my expectations. There was also another figure which I thought was very interesting, to basically show how Facebook allocates its sources where they know if they don't, it will hurt them really bad. So, one of the figures that was published in the Wall Street Journal is that Facebook allocated last year, so in 2020, 3.2 million hours on searching, labeling disinformation content. And I think, let me try and get the number right. I think only 13% of those hours were dedicated to outside of the US. So just to think of how Facebook is allocating its sources basically to the US is incredibly disturbing as well. And of course, it goes on to show how disinformation is running rampant in the Arabic language and in the region and many other countries, as we already illustrated. So, I mean, when you match the figures to the actual lived experience of users, the story makes full sense. And of course, it points to this very fact that despite of the gaslighting that Facebook does on a daily basis, whenever there's a crisis, they say, well, sorry, it's a technical error. They want us to believe that this is, yes, it's an issue of a technical problem. It happens to maybe a number of unfortunate users, but in fact, it's structural, it's material, it's physical, it's the time and money you spend and the resources you allocate to respond to the problems that result from your content moderation platform. So these papers, again, just bring us the evidence. There is no way for Facebook to say, sorry, we are trying to work with you, or in civil society calls, we're trying here to, respond to the elections in Lebanon. The question here is what sources are you allocating? What are you doing? What kind of products and services are you rolling out in advance to these events to ensure the safety of your users? These are questions that they need to answer explicitly before they, again, repeat the same lines of we're here affording security and safety and freedom of expression to all users, which, as we know, is, sorry to say, but it's BS. And then, of course, in other languages, like the fact that in Afghanistan, where according to the internal papers, that hate speech is one of the top abuse categories, Facebook took action to 0.23% of estimated hate speech in the country. So there are many examples that illustrate the same point, that Facebook is not interested and doesn't care. As simple as that. I wish if there's any other sophisticated way we can put it to excuse the company, or to maybe find like a engineering or policy or design problems, but it's as simple as that the company is not willing to invest enough resources, whether in hiring employees and content moderators, manual content moderators, or investing in making these automated systems run better. So yeah, I mean, I think that's roughly it in terms of the stuff that I've seen, and I'm very anxious to read the papers myself, and I think we need to dig further into that and draw patterns from what the papers or the leaks say.
Yeah, I completely agree, because even if this cursory review has just given us like these horrifying figures, really, that you're saying match the lived experience, it's scary. And then it is a matter of these kind of structural and material things that they need to do. So we've got several minutes left. I'd like to ask you both to kind of give your closing remarks and any calls to action, really. I mean, I imagine among the people watching, there's going to be people who are deeply involved in the kind of advocacy and lobbying work that's being done with Facebook, and people who are curious users, perhaps. Any calls to action you have on that front would be super useful. And I'll go to you first, Dia.
Great. Well, hopefully everybody has my email address. I'll just start there by saying, please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, but more particularly, I am hoping that civil society can come together and put out a statement just reflecting some of the things that we've said, and in particular, really with a focus on the 90% of users that are outside of the US and EU that are on Facebook now. So I and the other people on this call today have had a chance to see an early draft of a statement, but this is something that I'm hoping to share more widely. So please do reach out if that's something that you would be interested in working on. or just supporting, whether you're an individual or an organization. Also, I co-run a mailing list about content moderation with Jillian York of EFF. And this is one of the exciting things about that mailing list is that I feel like it's already started to expose some US advocates to more global points of view. And it's also given people from outside of the US and the EU the chance to speak to people who are at really big organizations that they might not otherwise connect with. So to me, that's really the way forward, is global solidarity, particularly with these global and US and EU based organizations rethinking a little bit how they work so that they can make sure that the proposals they're putting forward don't harm people who are already the most marginalized. So global solidarity from global organizations, but also so-called, South-South solidarity, so that we're supporting each other. And specifically pushing for solutions that are really focused on some of the things we talked about today. Process, making sure that people actually know what rules they're violating, making sure that Facebook is following its own rules and doing what it says publicly. And eventually, if they're not willing to be transparent, and if they're not willing to put their resources in place to actually mitigate the most harm, potentially, having some consequences for them, because they are not going to do the right thing on their own. But we also want to make sure that whatever sort of regulatory or policy proposals we're putting forth, that they also do not do more harm than good.
Brilliant. That's such a great summary. And yeah, thank you so much, Dia. And hopefully your email and also the link to the Como list, or should people will email
yes.
you?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, if you would like to be added to the Como list, or if you would like to learn more about any civil society work on this, please just reach out to me, and yeah, for anything, really.
Awesome. Thank you. Marwa, do you have any final remarks?
Two, as Dia mentioned, there are important global discussions happening that would potentially change the ecosystem as we know it today and change these platforms. And it's important for us. And when I say us, I know I work for Access Now. We're a global organization, but I consider myself, I am from the region, and that's where I work. And so I think it's important for all of us attending today to invest in learning about these upcoming regulations. And if you want to take part and join an alliance, there is the DSA Human Rights Alliance run by Access Now and EFF. So if you're interested, please do get in touch. There's a lot of material and brilliant analysis already published by many people about what the DSA is and what its potential global impact could be. And I think it's one important entry point where we can have an influence and somehow ensure that these legislations also work for us and not against us. And then the second point is continuing advocacy and campaigning and documentation, because I know sometimes we can get frustrated that we're doing all of this work. We've been doing it basically since 2011 and nothing has changed. In fact, it's only getting worse. But nevertheless, if it wasn't for the work that everybody's doing in terms of documenting and campaigning, we wouldn't have had this deep understanding of the issues we're grappling with and the level of discrimination that Facebook has been basically propagating through its decision-making processes. And so let's continue doing that. And of course, +1 to global solidarity, whether it's in the two parts of the North and South Hemisphere or across regions in the South. There's definitely more room for that.
Thank you so much, Marwa. And, the work that you both have been doing needs to be celebrated. Even if we feel like we're knocking on doors constantly, there will be a breakthrough at some point. And you have both done so much to kind of build that basis. Thank you so much. We're at time. That was an incredibly rich discussion. I want to thank you both. And I'll ask everyone to stick around because we're going to have the closing session for Bread and Net right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bissan.